So welcome everyone. My talk will be about preprocess 2. It's really difficult to name things. That's the second most difficult thing in software development. The other two are off-by-one errors. Yep. Okay. Sorry about that too. So it's really difficult to find names for things. Java originally had a software like package for I/O, meaning input/output, things to write and things to read. Then they came up with a new API for I/O, and they called it NIO for new I/O. We could have used new preprocess or new preprocess, but then we thought preprocess 2 is better. And I think Java has also gone for NIO2 now. So I think when we'll reach preprocess 3, we're happy that we went for the number. I'm Jarno Elovirta. I write code, and I sort of only write code. Very rarely do I write documentation. Sorry. That means I wear my programmer's hat on all the time. I don't really know how people use DITA or how they should be using, or whether S1000D is better or whether Markdown is better. So I don't really care. I just write code. And I know it's likely that the Death Star was documented using S1000D, but we'll never know. So I started to work on Open Toolkit 8 years ago, and then started to work more on the internals because that's interesting. And I work as a consultant for Wunderdog, which is a software consultancy. So I thought I'd start with going through what a DITA map actually is. So here's an example of a DITA map. It has a title and a bunch of references to other topics. This is one that is from DITA 1.0 era. That is how many years old?
About 15.
15 years old. Okay, so that's fairly old. And at that time, we didn't really have anything interesting in DITA maps. They were really simple. You just had a title, and actually that title, this wouldn't be valid DITA 1.0 because it was a title attribute. So in my opinion, DITA maps at that time were almost like topics. DITA has 2 top-level types, topics and maps, and then you specialize of them. And in the end, when you think about it, at that stage, they were almost the same thing. You would be able to describe a map-like document using just a title from a topic, and then use related links. It's almost exactly the same thing. The only additional thing that maps sort of brought to the game was copy-to attributes, which just create new names or new resource IDs, URLs for files. But in the end, they're almost exactly the same. Then we move over to DITA 1.1, where we get chunking. If I recall correctly, chunking was sort of part of DITA 1.0 already, but the spec says this is sort of undefined, and we don't really know how it works. It probably says exactly that. But it was poorly defined, so I think not many DITA 1.0 implementations actually supported that. Not that there were that many. At the time, it was basically IBM and some odd companies. It's a good thing to note that at DITA 1.1 stage, we also get bookmap, Before that, it was just a specialization that was shipped with, for example, Open Toolkit, but it wasn't part of the spec. And Bookmap sort of complicates things by adding additional semantics to maps. But Bookmap doesn't add any what I call functionality, like copy to or chunking or keys. It's just dumb semantics. And I know most people like to hate Bookmap for not having everything that's needed for publishing, like proper documents. But it's easy to say that Bookmap was poorly designed when the people creating them didn't have the knowledge that we have right now. Then we get to DITA 2.1, 1.2 and 1.3, and the complexity just increases so much that you can't even fit it on one slide. So 1.2 added keys, which is a really nice functionality. You can do all sorts of nice things with keys, but that's functionality that is fairly complex, and we start to break apart or break away from the idea that maps are almost like topics. Then DITA 1.3 added basically everything that is complex, or properly complex. We added key scopes, branch filtering, and even more, we are no longer at an environment where maps are almost like topics. They become processing context, where the idea that a map is a table of contents no longer applies. There's so much more in DITA maps now. I don't know what's going to happen with DITA 2.0 or DITA 2027 if they move over to naming them by the year the spec is published. But the complexity that we've added to maps, well, it's complexity to some people and then nice features to other people, they're not probably going to take away these features like keys, key scopes, branch filtering, chunking, copy to, and so forth. So we're probably stuck with this type of complex context. So this is a fictional quote. So to me, map is a context, but of course without the actual topics that contain the information that we will be presenting to users, that context is useless. And also without the context, the topics are useless. Okay, some people publish individual topics, especially if the content is still at DITA 1.0 era. And I know many people still have their documents at DITA 1.0 or almost at that stage. But these two work together, and you need both. You need the processing context and the topics. So I think that the idea that map is a table of contents is becoming more and more redundant. We don't really use it. When you publish your content, your users will not access it from the first node and then start to read onwards. In most cases, I think. We still have that in books, but of course your users don't have rules that say you need to start from page 1. They usually go for the middle of the book where they have a bookmark there. So in my humble opinion, maps are just processing context. We can just ignore the idea that they are a table of contents. And without the context, you really can't process the topics. The topics are usually not self-contained. So if you just keep on repeating the mantra that it's a processing context, it's not a table of contents, then we're on our way to what I'm going to talk about in the future, or in the next few minutes. But there are still cases where maps are, well, how should I put it? Say take an example, a DITA editor. You open a topic, it has keys in it. If you don't have the root map where to read the context from, or the map from, you can't really show what those keys are pointing to. They just become simple IDs that then some human needs to sort of remember or understand that what this means. The other example would be a preview. You preview an individual topic, and then if you don't have access to the processing context, and that topic contains conrefs or keys or filtering, you can't really show the final output there, and the preview that should show what the end result is isn't that anymore. You're forcing your viewers to recognize and understand how DITA works. You're forcing the DITA constructs on them, and that's not a preview. It's preview of DITA, but not preview of the content. So you need that processing context also for example, previews. And then I don't work for CMS. I don't really use them at all, but I bet that many CMSs don't actually store DITA maps as XML topics. They have their internal representation of it, where they're storing the relations between different things. They're storing keys, for example, in a different data model, and then when they're forced to, when you're publishing, then they render that out into an XML file that used to look like a topic but doesn't anymore. So the only place where we need the table of contents is when we need to create that table of contents in publishing, and in a way we could do that same thing with a single topic that just defines quite a few number of related links, setting the parent-child relationships. So, does anyone here know what preprocessing in Open Toolkit is? Really? No, I don't mean to be rude, but I was just expecting more people to know what preprocessing in Open Toolkit is.
It's a trick question.
No, it's not a trick question. By the way, is the echo from the speakers too loud? Okay.
As long as you stay exactly in the middle of the sentence.
Okay, then it's just me, because I can hear myself quite loudly. So the original preprocessing in Open Toolkit, which is the part where you take DITA content and then you massage it and do all sorts of nice folding and hammering operations on it. That used to be a process where both maps and topics were processed at the same time. So you start from a map, then you read all the references that are in that map, you collect all the targets of various links, and if topics contain links, you pull those, and then you start to resolve different features of DITA, like keys and conrefs and so forth. And you do all of that at the same time for topics and maps. And the actual order didn't make any difference. You could process half of the topics or the keys in topics first, and then for random reasons you would process the maps keys and then continue with the rest of the keys in topics. So they work the same, they were processed at the same time. Partially because when OpenToolkit was originally written or designed inside IBM, the skeleton of it at least, at that time, remember, we were at a pre-DITA 1.0 era, so maps and topics were effectively the same. Maps were that silly specialization-like thing that looked like a topic. And at the time, it was probably a good idea. So no reason to do it in any other way. And also, well, we have one person here who knows what actually took place inside IBM at the time, but I've gotten some word that the way IBM creates or created their publications was that you didn't just have 10,000 topics and 1,000 maps. You also pulled in content from other sources, and then you had to combine them in a complex SGML era system. So I'm not saying that the original design is bad. It was really good when it was originally introduced. And when most of you go home after the conference or conferences and you start to look at the code that is inside OpenToolkit, you'll notice that when you're processing maps and topics at the same time, it's a bit hard to reason about it, to really understand what's going on. There's structure there between processing different features of DITA, but it's a bit difficult to reason about. And it was okay when DITA-OT 1.x, let's say 1.4 was out. It was easy to think about it because we didn't have complex structures in DITA at the time. But then some people are the TC members here today. Okay, then the TC decided to add complexities into the DITA spec. And we had to implement these features on top of a design that wasn't perfect. And adding these new functionalities meant the code became even more difficult to refactor, meaning you change something and the output stays the same. So the more complex structures we get in DITA, the more difficult it is to actually maintain the code. And OpenToolkit is something like 15 years old right now, which is really old compared to what the kids these days are doing with JavaScript, where you have a new framework every second week. So when the DITA 1.3 landed on OpenToolkit, I implemented it on top of the original preprocessing, and it was fun, nice thing to work on. But then over time you feel like, yeah, I want to do it in a different way. I want to improve this somehow. This might not be the best time for a rewrite or refactoring, given that we already implemented the complexities of DITA 1.3, but it's always the same. First you move, and then you start to throw away the stuff you don't need. You always do it in that order, so that's the way we decided to do with OpenToolkit. But this is a perfect time that now that DITA 1.3 is fairly stable, I hope they're not coming up with DITA 1.4 next week. Yeah, I know. So because we're getting DITA 2027, we know that things won't change in the immediate future. So this is a fairly good time for a rewrite. So MapFirst Preprocessing is the stuff that I came up with, where we take the idea that a map is really the context, and in order to do anything with the topics, you need the context first. And you get the context by first processing everything about the maps. So you start with a map. If it references a topic, it just says screw it, I'm not interested at that stage. And we process the map as long as we can, and only at that stage, when the map is almost done, we start to read the topics. We can't do everything with the maps before reading the topics. For example, we can't read the navigation titles from topics and sort of stick them into the map before we actually know what's in the topics. At that stage, we only know what the URL of the topic is, or the file name of the topic is. So this split between maps first and topics second isn't total, or is not completely pure. And of course, while we were implementing this and then actually running it against actual content that in this case was the document or the user guide of Open Toolkit, we found out that, for example, you can do things that I personally find ugly, is that you conref from map to a topic. So you, for example, pull some content from a topic into the map, like the keyword in a key definition. I know people are nodding, you're doing that, and I'm here telling you that that's ugly. It's ugly only from my perspective, because as a programmer, I don't think in terms of, I wonder if I'll be able to pull this off with DITA. I just think about the implementation. And authors are intelligent people that can come up with interesting solutions that then the people implementing them would never dream of. But that's good, that's why we have different people doing the QA, meaning writing the documentation, or the docs that will be then ran with the actual tool, Open Toolkit. Using this MapFirst preprocessing creates a fairly simple flow of information. So it's a lot easier to reason about what's going on at different stages of processing. The actual modules that handle the data features like conref, keyref, and so forth, they're more or less the same still. We just ignore some files at a given stage. So, in addition to making the code easier to work, because that's an important thing, that your coders are happy and they're able to actually fix things and implement new things in 2027. I noticed that in some cases the processing became a lot lazier. So instead of with preprocess 1, that I'm now calling it preprocess 1. Preprocess 1 in some cases, depending on your source, would take a map and then it finds, say, 2,000 references to topics. Preprocess 1 would then read the 2,000 topics. And then after filtering kicks in, you end up with a single topic reference in the map, if you have lots of filtering in the map. And then you've just read 2,000 topics for nothing. And preprocess 2, actually, because it filters the map in advance, it'll only read that one topic. So in theory, this should be also a bit faster. Because of that reason, it's a bit lazier in some cases. So we needed to do quite a lot of background work in order to make this work. So when I started this, my naive idea would be that I'll just take the existing modules and I'll reorganize them and everything will work. And then everything started to work and it was lovely. And then someone had a topic that was closer to the directory root than the map, what we call up levels in Open Toolkit. So you have map in a subdirectory, and then you need to walk down and up in the directory tree, and everything broke, nothing worked. And that has been the thing that Robert and I are always cursing, that nothing works with up levels. And of course, we're not the ones that should be telling you that you need to put your files here and here and here. You should be able to put your files wherever you want, and then our tool should support that. And right now it does. Preprocessing 2 didn't at the time, or MapFirst Processing at the time. So we had to do quite a lot of refactoring in the way files are handled and with other things. So right now, if you run preprocess 2, instead of seeing your original file names in the temp folder when it's sort of the log is being printed, you suddenly start to see hashes of file names. They're about this long random strings with .dita at the end, or .dita map at the end. And that's just because when we start to read the topics, maps first, we don't know what the base directory is, because somewhere down the stream there may be a topic that references another topic that is somewhere. We don't know that yet. So we need to work with hashes. But good thing is that preprocess 2 will then, after preprocess, will rewrite your file names back to the original ones, because I know some people like the original file names for search engine optimization or some other reason. So when you start to work on this and have your original transformation types ported over to using preprocess 2, don't worry if the log looks a bit different now. So, like I said, I have no idea what DITA 2027 will look like, what sort of things they'll come up with. Do you have TT members? Do you have a list of things that you couldn't get into DITA 1.3 because you ran out of time, or someone wasn't the champion for it? So do you have a list of things that we're going to add at some point?
Not really, right? Not like that. No, the stuff that didn't go into 1.3 is mostly stuff that Elliot decided he didn't need anymore.
Okay. Let's pretend that Elliot, some evening when he's bored, decides that I need them now. And I've heard that Elliot is really fast at typing. I don't know if that's true, but I've understood that you're quite fast. So he comes up with 200 pages of complex requirements for DITA 2027. Now it'll be easier to implement those complex things that someone might come up with. So I'm happy for myself or the next person that will actually be working on those. Am I running out of time? So Ken Beck is one of the original authors of the Agile Manifesto. If you show the Agile Manifesto to a fairly young programmer at this stage, they'll think, yeah, that seems reasonable. What's so special about this manifesto? Well, it always wasn't like this. The software industry used to prefer the waterfall model, which is really good if you're, for example, building a house. You don't change the requirements in an agile fashion when you're halfway there. I don't know, maybe that happened to the Berlin airport, but in software, agile is really good. And I really like this quote from Twitter, because it took me about 2 years to do all the work that enables preprocessing 2 without having anything that actually works. Maybe it's a faith thing, or maybe I'm overconfident. Yes, I can do this. Everyone can do it. So why shouldn't I be able to do it? And you work on something for 2 years, you still have nothing to show for it, but you know that you're able to do it someday. So I had to refactor preprocessing a lot, add support for configurable temporary file names and so forth. And in the end, when you want to enable preprocess 2, you just add 2 into the AND file and that's it. So in the end, the change to enable it was easy. So we already shipped preprocess 2 in DITA-OT 2.5. No one even knew it's there. It was probably in the release note, but I don't think no one ever tried it out. Radu at some point when we told him. And it wasn't enabled on any of the built-in transformation types because we weren't sure that it actually worked, and it didn't. But now we are more confident, or then I've just been nagging about it, and Robert finally caved in. I actually have to nag a lot. So now we're shipping preprocess 2 as the default preprocessing mode for PDF, HTML, and Java help. No one's using Java help, right? Nope. So doesn't really matter. But HTML help is something that people still might be using. Is anyone using HTML help? I'm really happy that at least one hand, well, that's 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I'm happy that you're here. So one of the limitations of, for example, HTML help was that it didn't really work with up levels. We had a bug report about it. It doesn't work. And that's just because of the way HTML help's internal format works. It didn't work. Now it does. Because PDF2 allows us to ignore the up levels bit, and only at the end, when we rewrite the file names, we need to think about up levels. And the cool thing about PDF and HTML help is that you don't actually see the original file names anywhere, so we can just keep on using the hashes. So if you then go and look at the project for HTML help, what the file names there look like, it'll be a long hash .html, and that's it. But you're not actually seeing those file names anywhere. You don't need them for anything. So this is fairly a good candidate for testing out this new thing. If all goes well, and we don't get that many sort of showstoppers or things that prove that this design or implementation is really bad, we'll go ahead and at some point migrate all the built-in transformation types over to using preprocess 2, because of course we don't want to maintain preprocess 2 and preprocess till infinity. So if you want to enable preprocess 2 right now, just go to your programmer and tell her add a 2 after preprocess, and she'll be happy to do that small commit, and it should work. Should. I'm fairly confident, but of course, don't come and blame me if nothing works after that. So it's easy to revert. The original preprocessing code will still stay there until sometime when we've migrated to using it everywhere, and we're happy that it can just go and go to bit heaven. So future work, what we could be doing or will be doing. So this is the first proper implementation of this MapFirst processing. So we still might have some things that we need to fix or hammer out, or where the code needs to be strengthened a bit. So there's still probably room for improvements. What we decided is that we're not going to implement all the old extension points to preprocessing, because the assumptions that the original author of the plugin that uses extensions had no longer apply. So if you have, for example, an extension point that runs after keyref, if that is ran while maps are being processed, And the original author thought, yeah, I'll have access to topics. Well, tough you don't. So we didn't want to claim that this works exactly the same as preprocess 1. The output is the same, but not the actual processing flow. So what we're going to do is that as people find needs, that there needs to be an extension point here or there, we'll add them in future releases. I'm not going to talk about any of the other things I'd want to do, because I can't prove that everything, all my ideas are solid. But the one thing I'd like to do is do something about chunking, because chunking just is awful. That's something I tell you every year. Chunking is a convenient technology that is awful to implement. So don't ask me anything, but if you have questions, you can ask me now or later. I'm available over email, Twitter, Slack. We have a Slack channel for Open Toolkit. You can come there and ask questions. We don't have support. Like, if you want commercial support for Open Toolkit, then you just need to establish a company and start offering that support. Or then you may find a company that actually has commercial support for Open Toolkit. And I'm also available for hire via Wonderdog. And of course, I'm here today, so if you have questions, today is a good day to ask me anything, or things about related to Open Toolkit, or my opinions about S1000D. If you have any questions, you have 1 minute. Yes?
Your third point, which you didn't address, maybe intentionally, was the question of performance.
So,
If observing the memory usage after starting the transformation, it goes up and down. Is this something which you factored into your development?
okay, so
Question 1. Question 2, do you have any hints or tips as to how, for instance, our observation is that nesting DITA maps within DITA maps reduces the memory usage quite significantly. Do you have any sort of hints, tips or tricks on this?
Okay, so the question was about performance and memory usage. And because the memory usage goes up and down if you actually start observing what's happening there, and also whether I have any tips about when nesting maps in a deep structure, anything about that. So the memory usage patterns are still fairly the same, because we didn't rewrite all the modules. And in some cases, the memory usage is high, because when we're, for example, going through all the topics and retrieving the target title of a link. So you go into the other topic and pull in the title, we actually have to read a lot. Right now it's implemented in XSLT, which isn't a problem itself, but we don't really have a good way of throwing away the documents that are the targets of links. We do have an extension functionality that allows you to conserve memory, but then you start to lose the benefits of caching the documents, and then the processing time starts to go up, even though the memory usage goes down. So it's sort of, you have to pick either it's slower or then it's using less memory. And with nesting maps, this doesn't change anything with that. What we do is, in MapFirst processing, we read all the maps, squash them into a single map. We retain the points where those used to be like sub-maps. But right now we don't, for example, explode them back into separate maps after pre-processing, because we don't need that. Some transformation types do require that information. I know at least IBM needs it, but the relevant information is still there.
Just one last question, 30 seconds I guess. You mentioned HTML help. doesn't refer to the Oxygen web help, I guess.
No,
Same thing.
no. HTML is the what's the abbreviation or the way you pronounce the abbreviation? Chump. Chump. Yeah. The Microsoft HTML help toolkit workshop or something like that. It's a Microsoft proprietary help format. So it's not about the Oxygen web help. Web help and HTML help are completely different beasts. And I think web help is a somewhat, not overloaded term, but there are a lot of things in the world that could be described as web help. Okay. Thanks. Ooh.
Yeah, having the temp files in different file names, how will that affect debugging? So if you find something that's problematic, can you just compare? Is it hashes or is it random file names?
Okay, there we have the coder question. Thank you. So it's using the .job.xml file, which is the job configuration, that has a list of every file that OT knows of. It's sort of constructing the universe or address space for the universe in there. So you just need to go and look at from that file what was the original file name if you ever need to go back into the original file. But of course you have the temporary file in your temp file. You can use an alternative naming scheme. For example, IBM uses a naming scheme where they take the absolute path of the file and then just strip out the leading slash. You can use that, or then you can just do things like replace every slash with a __, so you get readable file names. But thus far I haven't needed to use an alternative naming scheme. Yes?
Just from my experience testing it out, debugging is kind of annoying with that, just because with the hashed out-of-the-box file names, it's not intuitive which file has the problem if you have to go in there. For those who know what they're doing and are getting into the code, it's not that hard to figure out because, as you said, it's in the job.xml file. And so I see, okay, I get an error message that this hash file name has a problem, or I want to find what was originally this source file name. I look in job.xml, I search for it, and it's a one-to-one match. So it is an extra step, but it's not a hard one. But yeah, that's in my testing, which hasn't been huge. Jarno pushed me to test for a long, long time, as he said. That's really the only annoyance that I've found with it. Everything else has been working great.
But I guess it would be possible to report, when we report an error, to automatically look up into the job file and, print also the actual file name.
Yes.
It can be done.
I had that same thought, but by the time I had that thought, we were so close to this release that I thought
Yeah.
Jarno would either hurt me or not show up here if I asked for it. So I didn't ask for it, but yeah.
Violence is never a solution for anything. Yes, I mean, if and when it clearly seems that when we get feedback that don't like hashes actually, we'll just need to migrate over to a naming scheme that is easier to debug.
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not the hashes that are the problem. It's just associating that with whatever temp file you need to debug. So using the hashes is great and solves a lot of problems, particularly the up-level stuff. It's just finding that file that went wrong if your authors, as authors sometimes do, did something bizarre and totally unexpected that you need to try and diagnose.
Yeah, because in the next version of Open Toolkit, like a major version, I could add the functionality where we actually don't write anything to temp anymore. We keep everything in memory. Think about debugging that when you don't actually have those files anymore. So it's good to know that people are thinking about it. So if ever there comes a point where we add the functionality of keeping everything in memory as like DOM objects or something like that, where we don't need to read them all the time for cases where you don't have that many files. The debugging story is probably something that we need to also consider while developing them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.